So first of all, Karin and I were in the back of the green room. We heard there was some talk about experiencers, and we're sorry we missed that. So there might be a little overlap here. And I'm going to speak for a while, and then Karin's going to speak, and we're going to show you lots of cool pictures. If nothing else, just look at the pictures, and you'll be happy. Okay, so in 2010, I published an intellectual history of the paranormal entitled Authors of the Impossible. I returned to the category of the impossible more recently, just this year, for a book entitled How to Think Impossibly. Basically, the notion of the impossible is the idea that impossible things happen all the time, but they're impossible because of our worldviews. They're not impossible because they don't happen. They clearly happen. So we have to adjust our worldview accordingly. The conceptual matrix of the paranormal, it turns out, was not born in the tabloids or in a science fiction novel, but in some of the most accomplished scientific personalities and elite academic institutions of the European and American academies. In figures like Alfred Russel Wallace, the co-discoverer of evolution with Darwin, and around institutions like Cambridge, Harvard, and a bit later Duke and Stanford. By an author of the impossible, I meant an author who writes about well-documented historical events that are not supposed to happen, but clearly do, and who, by writing about these impossible things, renders them newly plausible, imaginable, thinkable, in a word, real. I meant an author who theorizes the phenomena, gives them a cultural framework, and so makes them newly imaginable, even plausible. I mean someone who makes the impossible possible. I featured 4 such authors of the impossible in the first book. One was Jacques Vallee, a French-born American astronomer, computer scientist, and investor in advanced biomedical technology, who has written numerous acclaimed books about the UFO phenomenon. He needs little or no introduction here. Vallee, of course, became a legend in the 1970s when Steven Spielberg immortalized him as the French scientist Claude Lacombe, played by Francois Truffaut in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, 1977. For most of the movie, Spielberg followed quite closely Vallee's classic combination of scientific analysis, which he displayed in books like Anatomy of the Phenomenon, and his folklore and parapsychological approaches, which he set out in books like Passport to Magonia and The Invisible College. These were the books or double approach that Spielberg used, read, and loved. Accordingly, the story is structured around a classic UFO encounter that the central protagonist, Roy Neary, played by Richard Dreyfuss, experiences in his stalled pickup truck one night during a massive blackout. This contact in turn catalyzes a whole spectrum of parapsychological phenomena, including an overwhelming precognition in Neary about something that is about to happen on Devil's Mountain in Wyoming, where the extraterrestrial mothership finally lands at the end of the film. It was there that Spielberg broke with Vallee. After all, there are no unambiguous public landing scenes in the UFO materials so far, but there are countless apparent spaceships and intelligent life forms, as well as stalled vehicles, skin burns, electromagnetic effects, and yes, precognitions, very much like those featured in the first 3/4 of the film. The film was perfectly faithful to the historical materials then, up to a point. It is placing that point somewhere between the furthest reaches of science fiction and the impossible strangeness of the real that has driven the inspiration and collection of this archive. After Authors of the Impossible appeared in 2010, I continued to work in these twilight zones. Sometime in the early winter of 2014, I was with Jacques in Berkeley when he asked me a question. He was beginning to worry about his research and correspondence files, and he wanted to know if I had any suggestions about a university that might preserve them. He was concerned about these historical items being lost, discarded, or almost as bad, sold on the rare book market. As he is easily the most admired writer on the subject, his personal papers could fetch a pretty penny. But he was not looking for money. He was looking for future researchers who would take the UFO phenomena seriously. I went back to Rice and contacted our special collections director to see if we could host such a collection. The director was enthusiastic and asked me to approach Jacques with the possibility of sending his papers to the university. A year-long conversation, other visits to San Francisco followed, and a request to put these particular gifts on a 10-year moratorium ensued. These conversations came to a happy conclusion when Jacques visited Rice University in March of 2016 to give a lecture, meet with the Woodson director, and agreed to a major gift. Such a ufological launch of the archives made more than a little local sense. Rice University, after all, has a historical relationship to NASA. The Houston area, for example, became the home of NASA's new manned spacecraft center after President John F. Kennedy announced a decision to the world in the Rice football stadium on September 12, 1962, in his famous "We Choose to Go to the Moon" speech. Rice University would become the first university in the world to create a space science graduate program, and Houstonians would soon enough be proud of the fact that Houston was the first word spoken, really heard spoken, on the moon on July 20th, 1969. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. We affectionately call our city Space City. Our basketball team is the Rockets. Our baseball team is the Astros. You get the point. I knew an auspicious beginning. When I saw one, I approached another major figure in the UFO literary world with the same possibility in mind, Whitley Strieber. Whitley is a horror and science fiction writer who also wrote what is without a doubt the finest and most widely read autobiographical abduction account of the 20th century, a book called Communion, which came out in 1987. Whitley also happens to be a Texan. He grew up in San Antonio. Whitley responded enthusiastically. Like Jacques' files, his papers were considerable. After Communion came out, Whitley received tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of letters. We really do not know the number. From individuals, many of whom recognized the details of their own abduction experience in his intimate details, and now the famous face on the cover. And Anne, Whitley's late wife, took it upon herself to read every one of the letters. She hired a secretary to type up about 800 of them and eventually wrote a book about them called The Communion Letters, which came out in 1997. The first box Whitley sent was a box of these 800 letters. We now have about 3,400 of the letters carefully filed and stored in about 10 archival boxes. These letters, I add with delight and real intellectual interest, are filled with drawings of entities and craft, which my doctoral student, Amanda Nedham, is presently working on as a professional artist and historian of religion. So let me show you. Here are a few of there's Whitley, and there's Jeff, looking at the drawings, or some of them. There's a couple more. These are all from the letters. You see how many there are? I mean, this is just a collection of the drawings. Then came Ed May. Ed was the physicist who led the U.S. government's classified or remote viewing program in Palo Alto, California, not far from here. There was another center in Fort Meade, Maryland, by the way. From 1980 to 1994, the research was founded in 1972 by two other physicists, Russell Targ and Hal Puthoff. Dubbed Project Stargate, this program was funded by most of the U.S. branches of the military and intelligence communities. The project trained and employed psychically gifted military personnel and civilians to clairvoyantly spy on the Soviet Union, and so gather useful data to the American intelligence community. Again, drawing was central to the phenomenon. I think drawing is something we really don't think enough about, but you can see how drawing became part of the remote viewing protocol. The intellectual gravity of the gifts of Vallee, Strieber, and May created a kind of black hole effect. Soon others were attracted by their gravitational pull and approached us. These individuals included Stuart Alexander, a physical medium. A physical medium is someone who produces physical effects like levitation and materialization. Stuart was practicing in England. He gave us his life work with the mediation and help of the journalist Leslie Kane. These are just a few. There's boxes and boxes of this material. Richard Haynes, this is Dick, a longtime NASA scientist, aviation expert, and author of a number of books, including CE5, Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind, with a very considerable trove of photographs and scientific analyses. So Richard really specialized with pilots, mostly commercial pilots, but also photographs and scientific analyses of UFOs. And there are literally hundreds of these, hundreds and hundreds of them. Some of them are faked, some of them are not. You can see a long essay that Dick and Jacques wrote on the disc that was seen over Costa Rica. Brenda Densler, the scholar of religion and author of a book called The Lure of the Edge, which came out a little after 2000. This is Brenda's book and just another image from her collection. She gifted her library originally to Diana Pasulka, another scholar of religion and author of American Cosmic and Encounters, who then gifted the library to us. We also have collections from Stanley Krippner, the parapsychologist and anthropologist, myself, Larry Bryant, an employee of the Pentagon who spent much of his life collecting ufological materials and engaging in activist and legal work around FOIA, or the Freedom of Information Act and Disclosure Movement. Basically, Larry's collection is a collection of lawsuits, which is interesting, trying to get this or that piece of information. Wendell Stevens, including numerous letters of experiencers again. Dennis Stillings, a digital gift focused on the Archaeus Project, a Jungian-oriented research program around bioelectromagnetism, cryptids, UFOs, and other paranormal matters. Karen Everett, source materials for the documentary American Visionary, the story of Barbara Marx Hubbard. And Robert Fuller, a psychologist of religion whose father had collected almost every issue of Fate magazine, whose wonderful early pulp fiction covers and real-life stories has functioned since 1948 as a kind of Reader's Digest of the American paranormal. We are presently archiving further collections, including that of the researchers and writers Paula Leopizzi Harris and Clifford Stone. So Karin, please come up. I'll do this too.
Yes, please. I have not managed to. Is this on?
I don't know. Is it on?
Is it on? Is it?
I think.
Yes. Nobody's saying yes. Can we hear it? Does it sound like it's on? It is on. It is now. Okay.
Okay, there we go.
All right. All right. Leslie, I'm sorry that we missed your talk with Peter. I'm afraid there's going to be some overlap in some of the things that I share now, and we'll take that as a good sign that there's alignment there, that means that this is where we're supposed to be pointing our attention. As Jeff pointed out, one of the latest and most significant gifts is that of the John Mack Institute. Dr. Mack, for those who don't know, was a co-founder of the Cambridge Department of Psychiatry in Massachusetts and a Pulitzer Prize-winning author. As an elite academic and highly respected clinician, John's credentials uniquely qualified him to evaluate the credibility of abductees and experiencers and other forms of direct contact encounters, including the aerial school children from the 1994 mass sighting incident in Rua, Zimbabwe. For the better part of a decade, John was called to task by various members of the Academy for his unflinching advocacy of a much maligned, misunderstood, and marginalized experiencer community. Once trusted colleagues and friends accused him of having tragically lost the plot, of being gullible and exercising questionable judgment in his use of hypnosis to recover disturbing memories of strange gray beings who spontaneously abducted people out of their bedrooms at night. Those unfamiliar with his methodologies might be surprised to learn that many of John's subjects were in full waking consciousness during their encounters that left them with explicit memories of physical events that did not require hypnosis to recall, myself included. Many of his critics also don't know that John was convinced he would be able to identify a psychopathological explanation for the phenomenon. He was as surprised as anyone when his extensive clinical research revealed that experiencers were not, in fact, suffering from some exotic form of mental illness. Though John died tragically in 2004, I can never get through that. I can never get through it. Though John died tragically in 2004 after being struck by a drunk driver in a pedestrian accident in London, his legacy lives on in numerous ways, perhaps most concretely within 150 boxes of archival and research materials that were donated by the Mack family to Archives of the Impossible in 2023. Today, particularly in the wake of recent congressional hearings and the release of Lou Elizondo's book, Imminent, the subject of disclosure is rippling through the conversations of our ever-expanding multidisciplinary community. Behind the scenes and publicly, members of Congress and the U.S. national security apparatus are justifiably expressing growing concerns that UAP represents an aviation safety and national security threat. Darker conjectures posit that our visitors might actually pose an existential threat to all humankind. With such menacing themes contextualizing this dialogue, it bears mentioning that our near singular emphasis on these threat narratives is problematic, inasmuch as they fail to take into consideration the compelling testimony of highly credible UAP witnesses, abductees, and other direct contact experiencers. The fact is, even though the explicit intentions of our visitors are as yet unknown, and granted, there may be multiple agendas at play, previous informal research efforts have revealed that most abductees report a positive transformation in their personal worldviews, even when their interactions with NHI have been traumatizing. Again, myself included. This dichotomy means something. Indeed, it's one data point of hundreds that we are attempting to capture in the AI-driven research study that Archives of the Impossible and directors of the John Mack Institute have recently undertaken on the Strieber and Mack materials. We believe this effort cannot be timelier, given the fear-based language and thinking that so predominates today's disclosure conversation. Indeed, if humankind intends to develop a holistic understanding of a phenomenon that cannot be fully grokked through a reductionist, physicalist framework, one could argue that intellectual honesty demands that we take seriously the anomalous human history represented in these and other comparable collections. In other words, in other words, our best response is a holistic one that requires both scientific and humanistic approaches. Without a fulsome phenomenological inquiry, the experiencer community's knowledge will carry no greater weight now than it did 3 decades ago when John Mack was forced to defend his research in front of a Harvard investigative hard to say when you're nervous, investigative committee. Though he emerged from that inquiry with his tenure intact, free to continue his work, John was painfully aware of the toll the entire affair had exacted upon his reputation and career. In retrospect, it's clear that the gatekeepers of human knowledge were simply unprepared to take him, experiencers, or the phenomenon seriously. Instead, they rejected what they could not accept as a healthy and necessary provocation to their own sense of reality. Thankfully, contemporary scientists, scholars, and activists, including many in this audience, are increasingly defiant and prepared to challenge status quo thinking with the same intellectual and moral courage that so defined John Mack's character. We need to make it safe for them, for you, to do so. I would like to close with an invocation of the late astronomer Carl Sagan's words as spoken through his character, Dr. Ellie Arroway, in the movie Contact. By and large, experiencers and abductees are telling the truth to the best of our ability. Like Dr. Arroway, we had an experience that we cannot prove. We can't explain how or why it happened, but everything we know as human beings, everything that we are, tells us that it was real. We were given something wonderful, even if at times terrifying, that changed us forever. a vision of the universe that tells us undeniably how tiny and insignificant and how rare, precious, and interconnected we are. It is a vision that tells us we are greater than ourselves, that we are not alone, that none of us are alone. All to say, highly credible first-person reports of human encounters with the anomalous, the likes of which are represented within Archives of the Impossible, are essential to this disclosure conversation. They are simply the other side of the nuts and bolts coin. That experiencer accounts confront science with a weird spectrum of impossible phenomena that intrinsically violate the boundaries of reductionist physicalism suggests that to take the experiencer community seriously is to accept a Copernican-esque blow to broadly accepted materialist assumptions that have long been conflated with objective truth. And yet, if we can be as brave as we are determined, this phenomenon may very well reveal itself to be a powerful and revolutionary trigger right at the moment when humankind needs it most. Thank you.
I'll still go. I guess I have 2 more paragraphs.
Okay.
If you are done.
They're not done yet. He still has 2 more paragraphs.
There's more. But not much more. It's very quick. So there is simply no way any of this would have been possible without the leadership and capacious mind of Amanda Foke, head of Special Collections. Amanda, Karin, and I have worked closely together for many years now. We work on archival gifts, financial donations, and major conference events in particular. This is a photo of one of the conferences, the latter of which have smashed all IT records for the university, or at least the School of Humanities. To give you some sense, we generally receive about 500 hits for the life of a recorded lecture in the School of Humanities. We had 150,000 hits in 2 weeks for our first conference. The interest is simply overwhelming. The image I keep sharing with Amanda and Karin is a rocket going off. We are holding tightly to the rocket, but also falling off occasionally. I'm falling off anyway. We are professionally archiving the material as quickly and as efficiently as we can with significant help from PhD students. This is just one of about a dozen Impossible Scholar posters that we created for one of the events, and a rich lineage of young intellectuals and scholars trained at Rice University, some of whom are pictured there. We already welcome researchers and students from around the world into many of these boxes, folders, and files. The truth may or may not be out there, as one popular American television series had it, but it is almost certainly in here somewhere. Please come and help us find it. Thank you very much.